Chapter 30. March 1945. But not immediately, Josephine told herself, as Bill left that afternoon, leaving behind the ring on her index finger, so slender were her hands, with a promise he would return with groceries and coal and clothes and a definite but gentle refusal that she would move into the Sterling's townhouse 2 streets away. "I like the peace and quiet," Josephine told him as he left, 2 days later, and let him kiss her on the cheek. "And, before I marry," she told herself, as he walked up the road and into Dalton's domain of number 64, she still had one more thing to do, which could not wait. 88,888,888. The survivors of the still non-stop bombing of the capital still clung to its bones. Doors were flung open before being slammed closed and sandbagged up, to protect the people inside, modern-day keeps from modern-day raiders. Bill Sterling moved round with urgent, silent purpose, returning to his embankment flat and back to Marylebone over the next few weeks, and Josiah Hyde allowed him to make the arrangements for her to travel to Scotland. Edinburgh, Bill instructed, handing her the tickets. Then the Bridge of Allan. The reverse trip, Josephine told him, remembering when she had just come down from Ear House, before meeting Druce and shipping to Normandy. "I suppose it will be for you," Bill chuckled. "I have checked with GHQ, Paddy has been recalled. He will join us, as you requested." As I requested, Josephine thought, in the privacy of her own mind. It really does sound like a contract. And what would be her part of the deal? Bill had already told her they would abstain, lest she fall pregnant again, and the long shadow of this one, and her odds of survival, fell over them. Josephine may not even be alive at the end of this one. Every day was a bonus. Which is why she had to do what she was about to do, and trust Bill would forgive her. It was one morning, with the milk delivery that Josephine had never organized, that Dudley Clark supplied her with the coordinates she needed, his neat, round hand marking the location, a tiny village beside Lake Geneva itself, on the back of the label. She wished Charlie Collins was with her, and her mind drifted to her friend, wondering whether he had managed to escape and run home too. 88,888,888. It was the 3rd week of March, a Wednesday, when Bill Sterling arrived at Henry Druce's Baker Street flat, only to find the door unlocked and the air inside as cold as a tomb. No signs of life, nor had there been for at least a day. The key was on the hall table with a note. "Have taken the Scotland tickets, will be with you presently. Please lock Druce's door and keep the key. Ethan." His heart still not settled, Bill Sterling looked around the flat, but there was little of interest. The typewriter was still. Newspapers had been burned in the hearth, leaving nothing but grey flakes of recent history. He sighed. "See you soon," he told the empty dwelling. "See you soon, my love." 88,888,888. A week later, the heavy oak doors of Ear House were nearly torn from their hinges as Major Paddy Mayne surged into the hallway, smelling of whiskey, gunpowder, and the cold North Sea. He looked less like a soldier and more like a force of nature that had been denied a target for too long. "Where is she, Bill?" Paddy asked, his voice cold, menacing. "I've heard the rumors. I've heard about Colditz, a broken bar, and Berlin. If you've hidden my sister away in some Whitehall cellar, I'll burn this house to the ground." He sauntered in, standing in the hall, arms folded. An explanation had been demanded of his future brother-in-law. How strange that sounded, and Bill Sterling, standing at the top of the stairs, looked down at the man who embodied the SAS. He didn't flinch. He walked down slowly, meeting Paddy in the center of the hall, meeting him eye to eye. "Paddy," Bill said, his voice level. "Come, we can go to the drawing room and sit. We have to speak." "I'm not sitting." "Tell me where she is," shouted the Ulsterman. "She's well," Bill said, cutting through the rage. "That's the first thing. She is alive, and she is well." Paddy's shoulders dropped an inch, the raw terror in his eyes flickering. "And David?" "David is out of Colditz. He's on his own path." Paddy Mayne narrowed his eyes, with an uncanny resemblance to Josephine, and Bill took a breath, bracing himself for the impact. "Paddy, there are things you don't know. Things that happened between them in the castle. Josephine is pregnant." The silence that followed was more violent than the shouting. Paddy's face went white, then a deep, bruised purple. His hands, the massive, scarred hands that had torn apart Nazi command posts, curled into trembling blocks of stone. "I'll kill him," Paddy whispered, the sound vibrating with a lethal, Irish cadence. "I will find David Sterling and I will tear the heart out of his chest." "Listen to me," Bill interrupted, stepping into Paddy's space. "I went to her. I found her in London. She had nowhere to go, she told me she has no home left. I wouldn't let her drift, be homeless, Paddy. I offered to marry her. To give her the name, the house, and the protection she deserves. And she said yes." Paddy fury erupted. He grabbed the heavy Highland broadsword mounted on the wall, 300 years of sterling history from Preston pans, and swung, shattered a marble bust of an ancestor with a single, ringing blow. "A sterling!" Paddy screamed, his voice cracking with a mix of grief and betrayal. "You offer her a name as a consolation prize for your brother? You think a title under roof at Kia makes up for what my former CO did to her?" His voice dropped low and he stormed over to Bill Sterling, and raised the sword again, as if to do to the present incumbent of Kia House what he had done to the image of a former. "You know what we did upstairs to save her, you broken bar Druce. And now you tell me she is once again with child?" He stormed closer to Bill Sterling. "Your child?" "She will not name the father," Bill replied, "though I can pretty much deduce who it was," he thought to himself, wryly. "But number. Nothing of intimacy has, nor indeed ever will, pass between us. I offer her my protection simply because she will be a hunted woman at war's end. The Crown of Great Britain has a long memory, my family knows that." He watched Paddy lower the sword. "Now you are here, stay," he continued. "She is coming up, and has taken the tickets from Druce's flat I supplied, where she has been staying since last year. We will marry in the chapel. Her marriage to Michael O'Neill meant she converted to Roman Catholicism. Of course, she will have to be baptized and confirmed, but—" Bill broke off as he saw Paddy's face. "You let her come on her own from London to Scotland a broken bar pregnant, on such a long journey a broken bar." Paddy glanced to the door, his expression changing. "And when, pray, is she due to arrive?" "The 8:30 train this evening from Edinburgh. I'm sending a car." There was silence. A few seconds was all it took for Bill Sterling to catch on. "You don't want to marry her," Paddy told him. "And I doubt she wants to marry you, not really, except for the babe." "I don't doubt it," Bill replied, conciliatorily, holding an arm out towards the drawing room. God knew, he needed the whiskey, if Paddy didn't. She wants legitimacy, Paddy continued, half in a dream world, in the way she never had. She wants him not be beaten, or thrashed with a poker, or locked in a cellar for taking Barbara's doll. Paddy glanced to Bill. I gave Joey that doll because Barbara was 17 with no use for dolls, and she was this little wretch of a thing watching, always watching, with nothing, absolutely nothing to her name. I thought Mother was going to kill her over that doll. Paddy smiled, a slow, humorless smile. Then, it all made sense to Bill Sterling, her attachment to his home, her ready yes. Yet it was still his nephew or niece. Probably. And if not, he would still bring it up as a Sterling, he would still have her as a wife. On paper. She was as untamable as Paddy. Send the car anyway, if you choose, Paddy Mayne concluded. But she won't be on that train. 88,888,888. March 1945. The transition from the gut-wrenching screaming terror of the Blitz to the weary, grey twilight of early 1945 was not so much a relief as it was a prolonged, exhausting inhalation. London did not celebrate. Instead, it endured, hunkered down beneath a sky that no longer rained fire in predictable patterns, but instead spat the occasional, silent V2 rocket breaking streets, atomizing houses. Josephine saw the returning tide of the wounded and dull of eye. Yet, the men of the Special Air Service remained elusive, spectral figures flitting through the ruins of Europe or resting their feet in the chaotic, crumbling capital cities, waiting for a final order that seemed perpetually delayed by the bureaucratic inertia of a dying Reich. It was against this backdrop of architectural remains and the pervasive smell of damp wool that Josephine made her quiet, calculated exit. Bill Sterling, perhaps blinded by the chivalrous delusion that he could tether her to his ancient family estate, allowed her tickets for Euston Station, fully expecting her to board the night train for their long, rhythmic crawl toward the Highlands and the safety of Ear House. He had believed, with the earnestness of a man who had never been hunted, that the name of Sterling and the promise of a roof were sufficient anchors for a woman who had already seen the world end twice over. You should have known, Bill, Paddy Mayne intoned, as he drank the Glenmorangie offered to him by his friend, the sudden, devastating clarity that drinking enough spirit gave a person, that she would not come. He stared at the empty space, the chair by the fire, where his sister ought to have been, and glanced back to Bill. You should have known she would run toward the fire, not away from it. She is the most canny, the most lethal instrument any of you ever sharpened in the saw, and her ambition isn't for your name. It's for the head of the woman who betrayed the 31. The weight of the situation was compounded by a fragility that only the two men truly understood, for this was no ordinary pregnancy, but a precarious miracle of modern trauma surgery, and they drank till the early hours, by which time sobriety was dawning as well as the sun, and they would take action. For Josephine, however, the urgency that ought to have dictated absolute bed rest was, in her mind, merely a ticking clock, for she was carrying a Sterling heir sustained by Sterling blood, but her soul remained entirely, dangerously her own, and the risk of a fatal rupture was a price she was evidently willing to pay for the chance at justice. And she felt well enough. And surely if she had felt unwell she would stop. Possibly. Josephine instead headed to another station, hoping Bill would forgive her for what she was about to do. She explained quickly to the ticket officer that she was sorry, and could she exchange her. After the huffing and puffing, the man reissued the ticket, and Josephine was down onto the platform. King's Cross would take her to York, then on to Linton on a a Yorkshire airfield from which the Halifaxes flew. With a resolve that had hardened into something obsidian and brittle, she redirected her course toward the northeast, where the flat, wind-swept expanses of Alvington served as the launching pad for the night's more clandestine errands. By the time the moon had begun its pale ascent over the Vale of York, she was standing on the periphery of the airfield, a place where the air was a thick, vibrating soup of aviation spirit and the rhythmic, baritone thrum of Bristol Hercules engines. There, squatting on the oiled darkened tarmac like prehistoric predators prepared for a long-distance migration, were the Handley Page Halifax bombers, the rugged, four-engined workhorses of the Special Duties squadrons. As she watched the ground crews, Josephine looked for the gap in the flight crews. But she knew Elvington sent parachutists, and that night, 5 bundled up into the changing rooms. Josephine took a chance and, while a poor unfortunate air recruit had gone to the lavatory, she wedged his door shut, dressed in the uniform he had laid out and had collected a parachute, lining up with the others for inspection. By Flight Lieutenant Charles Collins. Charlie. So, he had made the home run too. So close to her friend, but she could say nothing, only watch his slight, trim figure organize the run. Parachute in hand, Josephine boarded the bomber, trying to make sure she did not catch Charlie's eye. The ascent into the night sky over Yorkshire was not a soaring flight of liberation, but a heavy, groaning struggle against gravity, as the Handley Page Halifax clawed its way through the thick, damp atmosphere. Inside the fuselage, the air was a freezing cocktail of oil fumes and the metallic tang of the oxygen masks, a stark contrast to the velvet silence Josephine had left behind at the station. She sat strapped into the jump seat, her back against the vibrating ribs of the aircraft, feeling every shudder of the airframe as a dull ache in their long, silver scar that bisected her abdomen. It was a madness that only a man could have contemplated. Every jolt of the Halifax seemed to test the integrity of her scar tissue, yet her ambition remained a more potent anesthetic than any morphine. She was the most canny operative the SO had ever refined, a woman who had calculated the risk of her own survival against the absolute necessity of Eve Mansoura's demise. As the bomber crossed the invisible line of the French coast, the world below became a tapestry of shadows and sudden, violent flashes of anti-aircraft flak of a retreating army that still possessed bite. Collins banked steeply, weaving through the searchlights that fingered the clouds like the skeletal hands of a giant. Josephine closed her eyes, her hand resting over the slight, guarded curve of her stomach where the new life flickered, a stubborn spark of defiance against the cold. Hours bled into a blur of engine drone and shivering exhaustion until the green light suddenly bathed the interior of the hold in a sickly, emerald glow. The circular hole in the floor was opened, admitting a roar of sub-zero alpine air that threatened to strip the breath from her lungs. "Go!" the dispatcher screamed over the gale. Josephine did not hesitate. She surrendered herself to the void. The transition from the thundering belly of the plane to the absolute, terrifying silence of the high altitudes was instantaneous. For a heartbeat, there was only the sensation of falling through an ink-black abyss, until the static line jerked with a violent, bone-jarring snap. "Do not have circumvented so drop spots," Josephine threatened, silently. Or, then again, why not? It would make finding Mansoura a lot easier. The parachute bloomed above her like a white night flower, and the descent became a slow, ghostly drift toward the jagged teeth of the Alps. Below, the mountains rose up to meet her. Somewhere in that frozen labyrinth, sheltered by the wreckage of the Reich, Eve Mansoura was waiting. Josephine was coming,